On May 9, 1587, a fleet consisting of 3 ships left England to sail for the New World. Aboard the flagship was explorer, artist, cartographer, and English colonial governor John White, along with his pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. White was appointed by Sir Walter Raleigh to establish a colony in Chesapeake Bay. The expedition team was mostly made of middle-class Londoners, including women and children, as well as 2 returning natives who aided the English in navigating the new lands. However, upon their arrival on Roanoke Island a few months later, the colonists persuaded White to return to England to ask for help. Before he left, White was still able to witness his granddaughter, Virginia Dare's birth. On August 27th, he left for England. But his timing couldn't be any worse. By the late 1580s, war was raging between England and the Spanish Armada, and Queen Elizabeth I ordered all ships not to depart and stay to assist the crown. White had no choice but to postpone his return. Finally, 3 years later, he was able to return to Roanoke Island. However, John would find the settlement completely abandoned. The place was absolutely deserted, save for fresh footprints and a fortification that wasn't there when he left. But no one was there. There were no English settlers, no belongings left behind, not even corpses. Nothing. It was as if they just vanished into thin air. But the mystery didn't end there, because White found something even more strange. 2 engravings, one on a tree and the other on one of the posts that says CRO and CROATOAN, respectively. The settlers who lived in Roanoke, including White's family, were never seen again. The mystery of the lost 115 or so early English colonists who landed in Roanoke, today's state of North Carolina, in 1587, was one of the most baffling events in American history. What happened to the settlers? Where did they go? And what became of them? One hypothesis suggests war with the natives. Before John White, there was a previous attempt to colonize the area ever since it was sighted by the English in 1584. However, tensions with the natives brought by food shortages led the first batch of colonists to abandon the island. So when John White and the colonists arrived in Roanoke, they made an effort to smoothen their relationship with the natives. One of those who tried to diffuse the hostilities was Manteo, son of the CROATOAN chieftain. He was among the natives who went back to England and returned about a year later with John White. Despite his attempts, Manteo failed to quell the distrust in all the tribes. Some speculate that the English settlers suffered an attack against hostile native groups, possibly as retaliation for the murder of Secotán chieftain Wingina. Considering the strong fortification built around the settlement, the colonists might have feared attacks from outside forces. Still, this doesn't explain why there were no human remains on the site. There wasn't even an indication of battle. If they weren't besieged by the natives, then where could they be? Others suggested that the English settlers might have left and attacked after they left the island. It's possible they encountered hostile natives along the way. The most popular theory was that the Powhatans attacked them at Chesapeake Bay, decimating most, if not all, of the colonist population. But this is merely a speculation. There is no hard evidence that the colonists reached the Chesapeake Bay, let alone encountered the Powhatans or other tribes in that area. This brings us to assimilation with the natives. On the flip side of this coin, this is a more optimistic hypothesis about what might have happened to the colonists. They were never found simply because they integrated with the native population. It wasn't too uncommon for Europeans who were either lost or separated from their groups to assimilate with the natives. In fact, there were reports of blonde, blue-eyed, and gray-eyed people who lived with the native population over the years. These foreigners who integrated with the natives would gradually lose their former way of life. Thus, it's not a stretch to assume that when the settlers found their situation too much to handle, they left Roanoke Island and somehow integrated with the natives who were happy to welcome them. Interestingly, when White arrived and saw the inscriptions on the trees, he was surprisingly calm about it. It turns out that he and the colonists had an agreement before he left for England. White instructed his people that if they ever had to abandon the settlement, they must leave a message to let them know what happened. If they were safe, they would try to indicate their destination. If they weren't, then they should leave a cross pate as a duress code. But the inscription on the tree was CRO, and on the colony fence, CROATOAN. If you remembered Manteo, he was a CROATAN, a native belonging to a tribe in CROATOAN Island. The CROATANs were among the few groups who were friendly with the English, despite having instances of close calls remember between them. If they left Roanoke in a hurry, it makes sense that they would sail to the only possible safe place for them, CROATAN Island, 50 miles to the south. Following that trail, White sailed south. However, a terrible storm tore off his anchor, forcing him to abandon the mission. He did, however, manage to stop at CROATOAN just before returning to Roanoke, but it is not known if he contacted the CROATANs during his time there. Had he done so, he might have confirmed whether or not the colonists were there. No one knows exactly what happened. Unfortunately, White never made it back to CROATAN Island to look for the colonists and had to return to England empty-handed. Years later, he died, never knowing what had happened to the colony, especially to his daughter and granddaughter. Another much darker hypothesis than assimilation states that a drought occurred which set the inhabitants against each other and led to famine, fighting, and cannibalism. There was already a huge shortage of food and supplies among the colonists, made worse by the delay of White's return and the tension with some of the native population. Harvard archaeologist Lawrence Stager supports this idea, citing that Roanoke had experienced the worst drought in 800 years at that time. Starvation turned to infighting, then infighting turned to cannibalism. Fortunately, there wasn't any hard proof that something similar happened to the Roanoke colonists, which brings us to the possibility of horrific hurricanes and climate change. North Carolina is a hotbed of hurricanes, and being an island close to the Atlantic, Roanoke Island gets hit by deadly bouts of weather from time to time. The colonists might have suffered such extreme changes in weather that they had to leave the settlement. Then again, there wasn't a clear indication that the settlement suffered a hurricane based on how intact the structures and the fortifications were. And in the end, whether the colonizers just couldn't take it anymore and started returning to Europe. Perhaps the most plausible hypothesis about what happened to the Roanoke colonists is the simplest. They attempted to return to England aboard a pinnace left behind in the 1587 expedition, but were tragically lost at sea, never to be seen again. And now, to the big question, what really happened to the Roanoke colonists? For many years, there was no answer to this question. In the 1930s, a strange but promising artifact was found 50 miles north of Roanoke. Called the Dare Stones, they are a series of inscribed stones attributed to none other than the Roanoke colonists, particularly by Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White. Written on the stones were records and messages signed by Eleanor, including one that explains why they left Roanoke. Another is addressed to her father. According to the stone, the colonists suffered war and misery after White left for England. About half of the population died out, and the Dare family left with the survivors headed inland to relocate. However, the survivors also died, including Eleanor's husband and child. They are supposed to have dug a mass grave near the shore, but it was later swallowed by the tide, so White did not find the bodies of the deceased settlers. For decades, the authenticity of these stones has been seriously questioned due to the lack of conclusive evidence. Then, in November 2011, researchers examined a map drawn by White, known as La Virginia Pairs, and saw that some parts of it were covered with patches. Back in the day, it was customary for map makers to attach a piece of canvas on areas where there had been mistakes. In 1585, White began drawing the map, which became the earliest accurate map of the area. With the use of X-ray spectroscopy, researchers found out that behind one of the patches, about 50 miles inland, was a tiny four-pointed star. This symbol was commonly used to signify fortresses. If it wasn't a mistake, White might have marked the map to indicate the original destination of their expedition, had they not stayed in Roanoke. Nicknamed Site X, the place was searched for any evidence that may lead to the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And guess what they found? Aglets, flintlocks, and balusters, all of which were common English possessions in the 17th century. This evidence offered explanations as to what happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke. But for now, they aren't conclusive. As technology advances, we may one day discover exactly what happened to the settlers of Roanoke. Then, we will be able to end the oldest and largest extinction event in U.S. history. But if this video has left you breathless, then you've hardly heard the story of the ancient city space observatory, that they wanted to wipe off the face of the Earth forever. Just click the thumbnail on the screen now, and we'll see there in a second.